The 3rd of May every year is observed as a World Press Freedom Day as declared by the United Nations General Assembly. The day is observed to raise awareness on the importance of press freedom and to remind government all over the world of their duty to respect and uphold the right to freedom of expression as enshrined under Article 19 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and marking the anniversary of the Windham Declaration. The 2022 World Press Freedom Day with the theme Journalism Under Digital Siege highlights the multiple ways in which journalism is endangered by surveillance and digitally instigated attacks on journalists and the consequences of all of this on public trust in digital communications. The role of the media is to act as watchdog to protect public interest against malpractice and create public awareness. A former spokesperson of the Senate believes journalists are operating freely in Nigeria.
Ours is to support and create that enabling environment for a vibrant, innovative, and productive media industry.
However, despite the Freedom of Information Act in Nigeria that provides for access to public records and information to the extent consistent with public interest, but till date, it's still a Herculean task to get information from the corridors of power. Journalists' requests are usually turned down and sometimes results to harassment. The Nigeria Guild of Editors in a statement says it's still inalienable right of journalists to disseminate information, and in keeping with such can one say there is independent press in Nigeria. The statement adds that editors in Nigeria remain under threat despite the practice of democracy in the country. The common challenges faced by journalists in Nigeria includes paucity of information, lack of access to verifiable information and data, harassment by security operatives, attacks on media personalities, sometimes leading to death. The head of the European Union delegation to Nigeria and ECOWAS shares his thoughts on press freedom.
Globally, we see more and more attempts to curb the space for free media, also by systematically undermining their credibility, and too many journalists have lost their lives or have put their lives at risk for having exposed inconvenient truth.
The latest UNESCO World Trends report also highlights some challenges being faced by journalists through surveillance and hacking, which are compromising journalism.
Still on press freedom, right? World Press Freedom Day was yesterday, and a good number of things have been said. A whole lot of issues have been raised, but have they been sufficiently raised? And have they been sufficiently addressed? What are the things that the media, the role the media has to play in this nation's, in the building of the nation? How well is the media empowered, even though it has a constitutional responsibility of holding government to account? What's the empowerment and what's the enabling environment to fulfill that constitutional responsibility? Those are some of the issues we'll be taking on with two of our guests this morning, but we'll begin here with Dr. Akingbulu, who is Executive Director, Institute for Media and Society, IMS. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, most certainly, first of all, let me ask you, a host of things have been said about the difficulty of practicing, of media practice in Nigeria today, perhaps made more complex by COVID and a number of other things that's happening. In terms of the environment for practice, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for this question. Environment for practice. I am deeply, deeply worried about legislation. Legislation. Again and again and again, the authorities put in place legislations that are disempowering for the media. And I give you two recent, even ongoing examples. The Electoral Act was passed just recently. You probably know that within that law, a lot of people have celebrated it, the passage and the assent by the president. But do you know that within that law, there's a provision somewhere in a certain section 95 of that law that says that during the electoral process, journalists must give equal coverage, prime time, equal coverage to all the political parties. And when we discussed with our colleagues, they said, how does that happen? And there is a penalty attached to it in that law. Millions to be paid by defaulting media organizations, millions and prison terms to be served by defaulting journalists. Indeed, the law says all the journalists, virtually senior journalists in the media organization that defaults. Isn't that terrible? We are in an electoral process going towards 2023, really disempowering.
So you think that it will be hard to achieve that clearly for the...
Clearly, for the media, very hard. And when you see the penalties that are attached, you begin to wonder. A second one, that I want to refer to that gives me concern. I'm sure you are aware that sometime last year, midway into 2021, there was a public hearing in the National Assembly, a public hearing on a number of bills, including a bill on amendment of the National Broadcasting Commission Act, which generated a lot of controversy. One issue there that people still haven't given attention to is that that bill has a provision on resource generation for the media, which disempowers most of the media organizations in this country. You know what that provision says? It makes a provision for what is called the digital access fee. That is under digital broadcasting. That would be a major source of revenue for the broadcasting industry. Every citizen will be expected to pay if you have to access broadcasting content in this country. And that bill says that the proceeds from all of that will be shared by just 4 entities. Who are these 4 entities? The signal distributors, 40%. The regulatory body, 40%. Then the national broadcasting media houses, that's TA and FRCN, 10%. All the private broadcasting organizations, 0. All the state government-owned broadcasting organizations, 0. All the others, 0. And that's going to be a major source of revenue. Meaning that major players, key players have been shut out at a time when the operating environment, business environment is so inclement, and the media requires a lot of resources to be able to stay afloat.
Just a quick one, Kyle. Isn't it also, maybe I should put it this way, has there been any role by any media organization or media practitioner to challenge any of these 2? Because I know that there will be more. It's just 2 that you've cited now. Have they been challenged in any way?
Well, as I said, the last one that I talked about, that's the one in the bill. The first forum, the forum for challenge is the public hearing. And I think the House of Representatives did the writing by organizing a public hearing to get input from the public, from stakeholders into that bill. And stakeholders, in all fairness, made inputs into that, made recommendations. I remember that I was also there, and we made recommendations on what should happen. So that, for example, we said, well, this issue of sharing formula, proceeds from this digital access fee, should not be a statutory matter at all. Don't bring it to legislation to start with. And then put it, say, under the regulator. Let the regulator, that's the National Broadcasting Commission, superintend the sharing of this, working with stakeholders. And then the expectation will be that all the stakeholders will have fair share from this resource that's coming, this huge resource that's coming into the broadcasting industry. So I remember that many stakeholder groups were there to make. And then we're expecting that this process will be taken to conclusion. The National Assembly hasn't said it will take those recommendations, but you never can tell. So I expect that stakeholders will continue to engage to ensure that the needful is done. That is by making appropriate provisions in the law, by taking stakeholders' recommendations.
And just a moment. I'd like to read that section which you talked about in Electoral Act, the section 95. So our viewers are also enlightened on what it says. And sub 2 says, or let me start from 3 because it gives some sort of preamble. So it says, that's 95.3 says, media time shall be allocated equally among the political parties or candidates at similar hours of the day. Then 4 says, at any public electronic media, equal airtime shall be allotted to all political parties or candidates during prime times at similar hours each day, subject to the payment of appropriate fees. So don't you think that's perhaps a fair provision then to add, subject to the provision of appropriate fees? So it's not just an all-comers affair. Let's be honest, if we have how many political parties, dozens of them, there's no way you can accommodate all the parties and even all the candidates. So don't you think putting the provision of subject to the payment of fees makes it fair enough? Okay,
first I want you to read that to the point of the penalties that are stipulated. But before you do, let me also say to you that that's another problem, with that piece of legislation. As we know, in this part of the world, within our own broadcasting culture, within Nigeria, it is not all electoral content or election time content in the media that is paid for. That's one of the problems with that. As you know, during the electoral process, there's a lot of public service content and the media. So it's unfair to say in every situation, money should be paid. There should also be provision in that law making a case, or there should be a provision saying, well, in cases, if it's in cases.
Well, let's just.
You do here, don't you? There is an electoral process. Yes.
I do understand what you're saying.
So it's not in all cases, that they even pay. There are situations where the content is public service, they don't pay.
Oh, certainly.
A lot of it. So,
well, for those who want to pay, they have to pay appropriate fees according to the law. Yeah. Well, we're not alone on this conversation, Dr. Akingbulu. Markwe also has someone else in Abuja. Good morning, Markwe.
Good morning, gentlemen. What a day it is here in the Federal Capital Territory. It is raining, or it has been raining cats and dogs. Visibility was very poor this morning, and well, pardon the fact that I'm just joining the program. We have with us this morning Ejiro Umukoro, who is a broadcast journalist and policy advocate. You're welcome to Sunrise Daily this morning.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
I was unsure. I think I did say that, whether to greet you Happy Press Freedom Day. And I think I had that same dilemma last night when my colleague was talking about this particular story I was about to hand over to me. I didn't know whether to greet. There's supposed to be a day that journalists celebrate, so to speak, but then there are questions as to whether there is anything to celebrate, because this day is also supposed to well, that was yesterday. It was also supposed to highlight the challenges that journalists face. From where you stand, do you see us having made improvements in this line in terms of journalism as a whole, as a profession, especially here in Nigeria?
There's still a lot of room for improvement. There's still a lot of room for synergy, a lot of room for understanding each other's role and respecting the roles as enshrined by the Nigerian Constitution. I mean, a situation where you have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary not respecting the role we play as watchdog and as the fourth estate, enshrined by the Constitution, leaves you mind-boggled most of the time. You see a situation between the interagencies, for example. They feel it's a beef between the journalists and the other agencies. Good enough, I think if we were going to talk about accomplishment, having the FOI bill into an act is good, but it's not enough if it's not implemented, if it's not enforced, and if it does not do public good for the Nigerian public. So if we look at the fact that we had journalists being arrested, I mean, when you categorize us as Nigeria in the space of press freedom relative to the world standardization, we are really far below. I mean, for us to be named as one of the country in Africa, particularly as the #1 place where journalists aren't safe by that index, I don't think that's good enough for us. So there's a lot of room, really, to talk about press freedom that it should be in Nigeria, that we're not there yet for it.
It is, you know, quite mind-boggling, because when you think of when I was still quite a child in the days of the military. I think by 1999, when they handed over, I was just about to enter university. But the early days of my childhood, I remember reading the dailies or reading Tell magazine,
oh, yeah.
and you used to hear a lot of stories of, you know, journalists printing from underground or writing from underground, and I had very vivid imaginations about them really being under the ground, you know, and writing. But one will say that we've since moved a great deal from that past. However, there are questions as to how free the press continues to be, even in a democracy. Yesterday, we're listening to Mr. Larry Arogundade of the ICRC or so, and then he was talking about how in some states it is very difficult for journalists to be able to write freely. It would seem that it's now selective, the areas where the press can actually claim some freedom, perhaps in Abuja here, in the Federal Capital Territory, or maybe in Lagos. And we sometimes think that maybe that covers for the rest of the country. Have we really been able to take into cognizance the dangers faced by journalists who are in other states of the country trying to do what they need to do?
What you just described is a case of weaponization of the brown envelope. I'll break it down. A situation where journalists are not properly paid. A circumstance where you enable an environment that pits the journalists at the mercy of government. An environment that promotes a situation where workers in state-owned media houses feel that they are hamstrung, right? They live in a straitjacket, as it were, and they can't speak truth to power. When you put all of these elements together, that is what enables an environment like that. And there's been a lot of instances where there have been compromises. You see weaponization of the brown envelope on one side, which means journalists fighting journalists. Where you see state fighting journalists. Where you see there's a disrespect for the FOI Act, the Freedom of Information Act, where you go to ministries and say, look, we need this data. You see all of that playing out. And then you see internal rancor to some extent, even among the different multi-layered media organizations we have in terms of agencies or as regulators and all of that played together. Now, when you see a situation, you have a regulatory agency not understanding that its role is for the public masses. Instead, it's for government's interests. We've got a problem. Because there's a difference between government interest and national interest. We've seen situations where it's presented to us that, oh no, it's about national interest. No, it's a government interest. And government interests are always driven by party interest. And party pressure, legal pressure, all of those kinds of pressure are the things that journalists faced. where you have internal policies within media organizations too that are not enabling media journalists to have the mouth, right, and the power to speak truth to power. That's another problem. Where you even have a situation where owners of media organization can oppress their workers. You've got a problem. So you see the owner's interest is on the one hand, you see the government interest playing out. All of these many interests, they are all confusing, even for the journalist. But at the same time, the big issue here is the fact that if we don't have more professionals in the media industry who own more media organizations, right, and who understand and value the job as a fourth estate, we're going to continue where we are, and we hope we don't go back to where you described earlier, Mark. Because if we should go back there, we're going to be in trouble, but we cannot afford that.
Some people will claim that, you know, those were, I don't know, maybe it was because of the era, that those were the golden days of journalism.
In terms of its excitement, right?
Maybe it was the excitement, but in terms of how journalists were willing to lay their lives for their country.
Oh, yes.
And were willing to pay the supreme sacrifice regardless, and that the job still went on. I don't know if you agree with that. Or maybe we're just, are we romanticizing it because we were not there? I don't know. I mean, when I mean we're not there, we were not with them at that time.
But I think they did a good job back then.
Yes.
And they were really living up to the responsibility as a fourth estate.
Yeah.
We need that kind of vibrancy.
Yeah.
We need that kind of commitment to journalism. That's why I said, when journalists don't understand that the brown envelope has become weaponized against them, they're going to continue to be tools. We need to be aware of even our own responsibility, whether directly, indirectly, consciously, unconsciously. Are we aware of it or not? How are we also enabling it?
Do you think that democracy also has played a role in terms of, will I say, removing the utopia? Because, you know, then it was seen that there was something to fight for. What the journalist was trying to get rid of was the era of the military dictator, and we looked forward to the installation, or it was seen the emergence of a democracy, and we thought, you know, that was going to be all and end all of our government, of our wars at that time, because almost everything was attributed to the fact that the people were not a part of the government. Now we have a democracy, so to speak, and it was seen that it is not yet delivering on what we thought it was going to deliver. Do you think that that has demoralized today's journalist?
I would not say totally. I would say this, that in a way there's been a shift from, go around the street and ask a typical Nigerian, are you willing to die for this country? The mindset to be willing to sacrifice for Nigeria is permissive totally in all our spheres of life as we speak right now. So that if you see it, it's manifesting even in journalism. That is not to say that there are no journalists who are outstanding in speaking truth to power and uncovering so much. I mean, when we talk about the strides of the declaration of the state of emergency in rape case and all of that, it's because journalists have done a good job of that. When we talked about the sex for grade marks that actually became a big deal, journalists have done a lot of that to make that come to bear. So we are also seeing an emergence, whether we like it or not. And I think that even the present system understands that, look, there's a different emergence happening. A young set of vibrant journalists are ready to tackle, are ready to speak truth to power and say things as they are. And I think as media organization, this is the opportunity for us to ride on that conversation and give that leverage. But we also need to protect our journalists. We need welfare packages that will protect them. We need good pay. We don't want them to be maltreated. We don't want them to be weaponized in many ways that we've seen happen again and again. But we also need journalists to learn to stand up to owners of media organization. We don't stand up enough to them. Some persons feel that's their livelihood, that's where it ends, they cannot fight the system. But you have to understand that for change to happen, you have to somehow hold the system accountable. That includes where you work. So even your terms of contract, all of those kinds of conversation, journalists don't really have that conversation. And I think we need to begin to have that put in place properly. We have so many bodies representative of the media organization. Now, they need to be more cohesive. This independence of I am of print, I am of broadcast, I am of the other online. No. We should work as a collective, because the stronger we are when we speak with one voice, the better we can affect the changes that we seek.
Well, there's so many questions to be asked in terms of what unionism has also done for the sector, whether it has helped better the practice of the profession. There have been many talks around quackery and its emergence, and now there are questions as to whether or not we should introduce professional exams, so to speak, something that qualifies anyone at all who desires to be a journalist, regardless of what he or she studied in school, to be a journalist, so to speak. I do not know if it's something that our guest in Lagos will support. Gentlemen.
Well, he's here. He's heard you. You want to speak to the issue she just raised?
Yeah, issue of capacity building,
or standardization.
Or standardization.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is important, but what I do not want in this is something that will be hijacked by governmental authorities. Capacity building, yes. For standardization, I would want such initiatives, to be industry initiatives.
Well, if it's going to be industry powered or championed by the industry, yes, how is it supposed to take on? Because one is wondering, with the level of quackery, the level of unprofessionalism and some of the issues that our Abuja guest has raised, one would wonder if indeed the practitioners of the industry are willing or able to take the lead.
Well, what I think will require more is collaboration, more collaborative work. There is no doubt in my mind that there have been efforts in this direction, efforts on standardization, even within the industry over time. What has not happened, in my opinion, is sufficient collaboration among stakeholders within the industry groups saying, this is the way we want to go, and then, speaking with one voice, not just speaking, but also walking the talk.
I'd like us to unpack a lot of the points she made. We probably won't be able to unpack them because there's a lot of them. But, there's this, I don't want to say it looks like we're daggers drawn, the press and the government. And I was reading the statement from the Nigerian Guild of Editors yesterday in commemoration of the day. And part of the statement says, we need to remind government at all levels in Nigeria that a free and independent media that can keep the people informed and hold leaders accountable is essential for a strong and sustainable democracy, including free and fair elections. But you often hear people in government saying, you dispress people. You're trying to look for trouble, or this, you're trying to, just paint us in the bad light. But clearly, a government is there, especially in democracy, to uphold the standards of democracy. The same way the press is there to also uphold the standards of democracy. So why does it seem as though we seem to have the same goal, but it doesn't look like they're on the same page? I don't know if you get that. Is there a fundamental flaw, really, that we're missing?
My challenge with this so-called position of government or government people is that they seem to pretend not to know that the Constitution, for example, especially creates a function for the media. And it's not for a joke. Not many institutions have such functions created for them. Section 22 says the media shall have the power to hold government accountable to the people. So when such an institution has such a mandate, from the Constitution, and such an institution wants to carry out this mandate, but in carrying it out, do we say it collides with the interests of those in government? Because to hold government accountable means you want to look into the activities of government. What are they doing? And that's not what they like. And that is why you find these big problems, attack on the media, on journalists all over the place, state governments all over. And then, they just, a journalist has written something, put something on his neck, terrorism charges.
Dr. Akingbulu, I find it amusing sometimes when these issues are raised. The issues Kade has raised, which made you, refer to the Constitution, only brings one thing to my mind. There are pressmen in government. There are always pressmen in government, at least to the best of my knowledge. Every press secretary, information officer, PRO, chief essay media, whatever it is, they are usually from the press. So isn't it possible or important for them also to see this constitutional responsibility and make known to their principals that, look, this is important?
My reading of the situation is that once in many of our colleagues who change roles, so to speak, move from the media into the side of government as special assistant media, special advisor media, chief press secretary, all those roles. In many situations, they find themselves in a dilemma where, yes, I have come from a constituency which has this role, and this is the role that they are playing. But then you find yourself in another constituency where the occupant of that position doesn't see things that way. These people, these press boys, can't just be writing things against us anyhow. They can't just, I mean, they say press boys can't just be writing, and there you are. And then the guy begins to say, Phil, if I continue to tell him the truth, he fires me. The guy probably doesn't want to get fired. So it's a dilemma. You know, I see, this is my reading of the situation, that they find themselves in a very difficult position. And they are unable, yes, you know, to really engage their principles, the new principles on the other side.
I think it points to a point she also made.
Yes.
It's interesting how this conversation is building about the fact that, you know, there's a business angle as well. There's the economical or the economic angle to this. I mean, it's a job, right? It's a job that is meant to hold government accountable, yes, but it's also a job that should pay, as it were. So the example, for example, the example of those in government who are pressmen, don't forget they also have to earn money. So essentially their terms of reference is based on the perceive or the perception of the government in power, what the government wants. Okay, I don't want too much bad stories about me, or I don't want these things to get out. So is there a way to, because you've been in this for decades, so I know you can give some insight. Is there a way to balance that act? Because there's that role which should not be tainted by either economic or whatever, you know, issues. But there's also the money angle. So you don't want to lose a job, but you also want to hold government accountable. So how do you balance it?
Well, it is something that I think it's a tough thing, really, but the way to do it is also to get stakeholders, you know, to interact, to have lots and lots of discussions at various levels. People who do media work, you know, for government, with their principles, various levels.
And even the ones in private too.
Yes, and even the ones in private, I agree. People who work at that level with their principles in the media, different levels, you know, of engagement that I think, so that people will understand. It will be difficult because I know, for example, every politician, every office holder, political office holder, wants to have positive image all the time. So you don't want. But you see, you want to have positive image all the time, and there are gaps. You know, your performance, there are things you're supposed to do to deliver. Maybe you already made promises when you were campaigning. And then the media begin to say, you said so, so, and so at that time. But here we are, 1 month or 1 year later. You were supposed to have done this after 6 months. But your government hasn't done this, and they don't want to hear that one. So it's a difficult situation, but I imagine that the way to go would just to continue to have dialogue at different levels among stakeholders.
Okay. Well, there is a lot that's also happened in the media since the Third Republic. What we had back then was more of analog than digital broadcasting. And now, digital is not just one of those things, it's a major thing, such that everyone who is anyone is there. So, and that's around the conversations of World Press Freedom Day this year. We'll look at that and a number of other issues around that when we return from this break. Please stay with us. The theme of this year's World Press Freedom Day is journalism under digital siege. And yesterday when we began this conversation, we were asking questions around whether or not or how the media practitioners of the days of yore have been able to transit. So Dr. Akingbulu, let me begin that part with you. Well, the conversation is around journalism under digital siege, and it's a global phenomenon, but even more in our part of the world. There are so many issues around that. There are those who are pointing at, in fact, I think it was about 5 or 7 years ago, there was a conversation around who breaks the news, social media or traditional media. So who follows the news now? Who is playing catch up? And it would seem like today, the social media is doing a lot of things that the regular media is self-censoring. So there is that challenge. The transition between journalism as we knew it before this Fourth Republic became as strong as it has become, and now, that transition has been quite something, quite significant in the practice. How significantly would you say the digital journalism has impacted journalism in Nigeria?
Well, I think it has helped to build capacity. Why did I say so? Journalists began to find out that now, under this new dispensation, they had to engage, say, a global audience. In those days, we were writing for the typical maybe newspaper or for the radio or TV, and then for a local audience restricted. Now, as we are, even on this program now, well, I imagine how far, the content, has gone. So that means we need, to sit down and be very, very careful. We are engaging a global audience far, far wider. Content is going further, and then we need, to be more careful. Secondly, there are more players. You say digital now, far more players. That is, in addition to the journalists, you have other players who are there. And many of those players are players who do not care much about standards. So the journalist has to make sure, we really need to be very, very careful. We've got to keep sanity, to make sure, that this whole environment, is not, to use the word, polluted. So it makes the journalist want to work harder. It makes the journalist want to acquire, new skills to be able to do very well. These are things, that I see. It makes media professionals, in general, want to see what is in it in terms of business. This is a bigger arena. So how much of resource, can we get here, to the traditional resources that we used to get?
Very interesting angle, and it formed part of the index, the ratings that Reporters Without Borders did for the 2022 Press Freedom Index. Nigeria, yesterday we were still talking about how Nigeria ranked, 120 in 2021, but now we've even dropped further to 129. So from 115 in 2020 to 120 now, 129. And I'd like to take this to our Abuja guest, and looking at that particular ranking, you see China, for example, world's largest economy, or at least second largest, depending on how you look at it, ranking 175, even the US 42. And I'd like to get your thoughts about that, because some will ask, would you rather choose the economy of China over the press freedom of China? Because apparently a lot of people think you have to maybe stifle press, or at least stifle bad reporting of government to have a prosperous economy. It's a bit warped, but I wonder what you think about that.
For us in Nigeria, it's a two-edged sword. Because one, we have to ask ourselves, are we in a democracy or are we in an autocratic setting? If the spirit of democracy is what we are espousing, then we have to live up to that responsibility. And that's why the NBC, for example, has a critical role to play. that we're dropping on the index is kind of sad, and it highlights the fact that constant harassment of journalists, invasion of their privacy. We've seen high-end murder cases. We've seen false allegations thrown at them. A situation where we don't even understand that the journalist is not an essential service. We even need to correct that impression. We're beyond essential services. You have the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and then the media, the fourth estate. So we're not just an ordinary essential service. We are recognized by the Nigerian constitution, unlike in Chile, for example, where countries like that don't have that kind of conversation. Do you know what I mean? So in Nigeria here, I think the conversation we should be having is, how do we now begin to get the citizens to also be on our side? So that they too, with their voices, with the way digital journalism has gone, you have the citizen journalism become a mainstay, whether we like it or not, even though we have to do our job of standardizing it, using ethics, and then verifying some of the things we see online. They actually do help to drive this conversation. So what we should be looking at is, how do we get the citizens to be more on our side, to understand that our role is that important? And how do journalists themselves too fight for one another? We've seen situations where journalists could be in front of somebody of importance, a politician, say for example, and the politician insults the journalists, or call them names, or maltreat them, or even ask their aides to manhandle them. You see another journalist having the audacity to tell the fellow journalist to not talk. Now, it goes back to the fact that when you have persons in that space, it goes beyond just having paper qualification. We've seen many people with paper qualifications who do not do the job as required. In other words, what we need now is an instilling in the Nigerian journalist the respect and the prestige that goes with that job to also do it more effectively. We want a situation where even our legislature, the quality of the representation we have in our legislature is a reflection of the quality of the kind of electoral process we also run. And the citizens are also involved in this. And we are also very important in this process. So if we have more quality representation at the National Assembly, from what happened in the ECOWAS case, where they had to make a case and say, look, no, the Nigerian position on that Prohibition Act, right, the Cybercrime Prohibition and Protection Act 2015, which regards to Section 24, is outlawed. So if we say we're a democratic country, then it behoves on the executive, the judiciary, the legislature to live up to that. And they may also need more training and retraining. Same way journalists also need these kinds of reminders to make us understand that, look, we've got a job to do here. It's a job we have been given by the Constitution to do. So there should be no question about that. And I like what our guest in the Lagos studio was saying. Public officers are elected by the Nigerian citizens, journalists included. Now, if you go into public service and you're not ready for the criticism that we go with that job, please don't come to that space. You have no business being in that space. We need them to have that reorientation as we gear up to 2023. We want a situation where anybody coming into elected office would understand that, look, there's a job to do. There will be gaps. And that's why their media aides play a very crucial role. And most importantly, getting media aides who understand that, look, when I'm wearing my journalism hat, I'm wearing the journalism hat. When I'm wearing a PR hat for the politician or in politics, I am wearing that hat. There should be that consciousness to begin to delineate these differences. In other words, when you are serving as media aides to these politicians, there are moments where you will have critical discussions with your principal. You need to be able to bring your principal up to speed. And there are ways to do that in how you speak, in the memos you send, in how you engage them in the conversation. When you make them understand that these are the issues, then they do better. And then they will understand that the criticism is actually to make them better in their public service. So being an elected official does not make you draconian. It does not give you the right to abuse journalists and talk down on them, harass them, invade their privacy, carry out all kind of horrible acts against them. It's against the law, by the way. And so we need a more effective Nigerian government who will make sure that when journalists are maltreated, there is expeditious judgment If it means even arresting police officers who harass them, please use that as an example. If it means dealing with them properly, using the law as far as it can go, please do that effectively. Journalists have an important role to play. Without them, the things they do as the executive or in government will not be known to the public, who are the citizens. So if they want us to do our job, they are better do their job as well.
Well, interesting when you talked about the role of media aids, and I remember at some point along the line of this work, one had to think as to what exactly is the career path for a journalist. It was seemed that the pinnacle was becoming a media aid to an elected official, and it was seemed that there was that question of is that how it's supposed to progress? Unlike what we see outside of the country, let's talk about even broadcast journalism more specifically. What you see outside of the country, where people in their 60s, people are doing this broadcast work even up till, until they decide that they want to retire. Maybe they've gone 40, 50 years in broadcast. But very rarely do you see people who are grey or, getting grey still on TV in Nigeria. The chances that they'll say, oh, what is he or she still doing there? By now you should have given way to younger people. That question, continues to, it bugged my mind for quite a while until I achieved some clarity on just what the trajectory of a journalist should be. But I do not know how clear it is for those who are coming behind as to what exactly the career path for a journalist ought to be.
Many young persons in the media, whether they come through as mass communication students or like some others who just are good at that job, that's like a gift for them. They navigate their space into that and gain the experience of the job. What they are not taught consciously is that there are many career paths. I've had opportunity to interact with young students. I train, I teach and stuff like that from time to time. And one of the things I discovered is many of them just think, I just want to be a newscaster. It ends there. It just ends there. That's where it ends. So it means that there's a lot of work we need to do in the training, in the curriculum, the design of it should be that you want to expand their imagination to know that they have so much options they can tap into. The trajectory, understandably, in Nigeria is what it is. Like I said, our income has been a weaponized tool in the hands of government. And that's why we need more persons with experience to be on the job. Ownership in Nigerian media is critical here. A situation where you don't have professionals who are owners of the media, you're going to constantly have these bottlenecks and these challenges mitigating against our advancement. But another thing is, even while in that space, as media organizations, if you notice how we even churn out content, the programs we give out, you know that there's a limitedness. Check out many of the media organizations nowadays. They just want to be a music station. That doesn't only just border on laziness, it borders on outright unwillingness to live up to the job of what a true media should be. And when you now have members, supposedly experienced journalists in that space, handling the positions as GMs and all of that, or head of programs of content and stuff like that, and you don't see them try to tweak it a bit and do much more than that, you limit the options even for the younger ones coming. They now feel, okay, the next top level for me is to take this next job in government. So we are the ones in a way that need to consciously now change that trajectory for them.
Well, Lady Umukoro, you have said it in a way that, I don't think many could have said it. Thank you so much for coming on Sunrise Today this morning. She is a broadcast journalist, and it's very obvious and clear in terms of how she's spoken, and also a policy advocate. Thank you once again for coming on Sunrise Today this morning. I throw this over now to my colleagues in Lagos, gentlemen.
Well, thank you, Dr. Akingbulu. That conversation we're having right now, I'd like us to wind down on it. And it talks about, training those coming behind. I mean, that's the expression that is used. And I've had this challenge, suggesting to maybe institutions that, how about you have practitioners, those who have spent time practicing, also be a part of the teaching process? Because they'll tell you, okay, you need to go through your master's first, get your PhD. And for those people who are practitioners, they probably don't have time to go through all that, but they have the experience up to date. So is that something that you think might help actually to build those coming up so that they can have the right perspective, their horizons are widened to approach this job?
Sure, I agree with you. It's a good pathway to go. And I know that it happens in other climes, other countries, to be able to strengthen capacity building. I agree with you. It's a pathway to go. I also know, that these kinds of arrangements, are taking shape. And I want to implore our colleagues on both sides use this, to key into these kinds of initiatives so that, we can have better capacity building arrangements within the country. I agree with you. You're right.
I could go on and on with you because, you began by throwing bombs with all of the legislations. I just hope that, there are things that we would really be able to take on succinctly. Dr. Akingbulu, Executive Director, Institute for Media and Society, thank you so much for being a part of our conversation this morning.
It's my pleasure. Oh, thank you.
Well, one of the things that the media does is hold government to account, upholding accountability to the people. And that's what we're talking about when next you see us after this break.